Armed conflict has been with us since the dawn of civilization. Archaeologists have unearthed evidence of armies as far back as 10,000 BC. Military history has always existed on a grand scale, with legendary battles fought on land, sea, and air. From ancient daggers to modern medals of honor, in expert hands, these relics reveal the stories of those who are no longer here to speak for themselves. Join us as we unlock the secrets of Militaria. Today on Militaria, we will look at a diary with insights into the life of a soldier, a timepiece that has seen times without peace, as well as an impressive trio of early war medals. Andrew Moss looks at a collection of World War I medals that date back to very early on in the war effort.
They were my dad's World War I medals. He served in the First World War and he passed away in 1955 when I was the age of 10.
Mark People looks at a World War II pocket watch used in Canadian military vehicles during the war.
Came across this one. The ordnance number was very different, didn't have the GSTP. I went online to try and do a little research on it, was not able to find out a whole lot.
Mark also looks at a diary from a First World War Canadian soldier who endured many trials and hardships of warfare.
It was written by a private Frank Harper from Tignish, Prince Edward Island, and details his time in the trenches.
I'm Steve Jennings, and I'm a watch and history collector. So I brought in a World War II watch today. I've heard that it was a watch that was used in Canadian military tanks, in armored personnel carriers and whatnot in World War II, but I have no verification of that. I really don't know a whole lot about this particular watch.
Mechanized tanks were first developed by the British and French during the First World War. Although they were a fearsome presence on the battlefield, early tanks moved at a walking pace and were unreliable. By the Second World War, improvements in armor, suspension, and armaments made tanks a deadly and devastating force. Deployed in theaters of war from the deserts of Egypt to the tangled jungles of Burma and the frozen streets of Leningrad, tanks were a versatile weapon used by all the major combatants of both the Axis and Allied nations. Equipping the tanks with radio communications enabled coordination and tactical maneuvering to maximize their ferocious killing power.
Steve, you brought in a couple great items here. What are these and what significance are they?
I brought 3 watches with me. Well, these are World War II era pocket watches. They're all very similar with the exception of the one with the white dial.
These are actually general service timepieces, and that's an Army use watch, and it was used throughout 39 to 45. And these particular ones are great examples of that. Actually, one of these has got GSTP stamped on it, and the arrow indicating it. This is a British one. The interesting thing with the one that you brought in is that it is actually a C on it, which defines it as a Canadian-built one. This type of watch was used in actually a radio set. This type of radio was only used in military vehicles, so tanks, armored cars, scout cars. It was a fairly new technology, and Canada was at the forefront of creating this technology and producing it, and it was a vital part of the Army.
So in terms of a watch, I'm a little confused as to why the military would have been issuing pocket watches to soldiers and putting them in armored vehicles when everybody else at this point was wearing a wristwatch.
These type of pieces obviously provided a technology that was proven. It was exactly what they wanted. It's not too large, it's not too small, it's unobtrusive, and it would be sitting inside on the face of the radio unit as it sat in the vehicle. Those particular units would rely on those timepieces obviously to coordinate radio messages. They would be logging those radio messages as they communicated. The radio units obviously had some flexibility because they could talk 3 different ways,
right.
Long distance or short to vehicles as they moved across, or internally. The biggest intercom would be the fact that they would be able to communicate within the vehicle and to talk to each other, which they hadn't had that feature before. Time plays a critical part of any sort of military operation, particularly if you're starting your shelling operations or you're starting your movement. Where do you want those people to be, and coordinating the time with that. These particular timepieces were proven, and I think that's why that they had it from there.
So I have a pretty good idea about these watches here, which were kind of used by infantry, but this one that was used in the radio, who Who would have been using it, and why would he have needed to use a watch like that?
The difference between the watches obviously is quite stark. We've got black and luminescent, where this is white with black on it, not luminescent. As being part of this radio system, the inside of the military vehicle or the tanks or whatever they were using were white. So obviously it fits in, and part of the radio, they wanted to be able to look at it and see it and make it stand out, and that's why they've done it that way. Who would use this obviously would be the tank crews and military vehicle operators. The typical crewman would be stuck in his vehicle and basically moving across the countryside. They were tied to the vehicles. So this would be an integral part of the radio system, and it would be something that they would look at and work with and follow all day. In August of 1942, the Dieppe raid, where a large number of Canadian troops stormed the beaches at Dieppe in France, they were the first usage of that radio system, and their tanks were equipped with it, and the armored cars were equipped with it. They had sent armored cars to go on the beaches, and they communicated back and forth, even though a lot of the tanks were disabled. So there was still some communication with it. Being able to have that option that they hadn't had before was certainly changing. Once the largest scale invasion happened in June 6, 1944 with Dieppe, we see a big movement of vehicles and tanks and a number of ways to communicate within the various formations that were sent in. So again, tanks going across would be able to relay the information back to the troops coming behind, and it really revolutionized it. In a number of cases, they were actually using these radios, providing them to infantry so they could talk to the tanks as well, and they would be on carts, and the infantry would pull them along with them so they have some way to communicate with the vehicles. So the big, large formations of tanks would be able to do it, and they'd be able to start seeing that way. Once they got into places like Normandy and moved towards Holland and along the coast, these type of systems would be very useful to be able to relay with the information to each other and to follow from there. These are great examples of military timepieces. Where do you see the future of these great items?
Well, I use and wear my watches now, but I have a son that's in a master's program in history, and he has great interest in these as well. So over time, I'm assuming I will pass these along to him, along with the stories and the knowledge that I've gained on where they came from and what they were used for.
Well, thank you, Steve, for bringing such great items. And obviously, we just see timepieces that are just sitting here, but the whole backstory of what it was part of and component is a bigger part of it. And I think that's the great story that we could take from this.
And that's what I'm taking away from it. I really appreciate the information you were able to give me that I didn't know already, the backstory on some of these things. I mean, they've all got a story to tell, and now I know a little bit more about the story behind that one. That was kind of fun. It was good to get a little more detail on some of these pieces and some context on how they were used and the difference they made. Each one of them has a story to tell, right? It made a difference to someone at some point in time, and it's nice to know what that was.
Coming up on Militaria.
It was written by a private Frank Harper from Tignish, Prince Edward Island, and details his time in the trenches. My name is John Wales. I'm the Deputy Curator of the Nova Scotia Highlanders Regimental Museum in Amherst, Nova Scotia. I brought in a diary from a First World War Canadian soldier, Frank Harper, originally from Tignish, Prince Edward Island. We are trying to find a living descendant that we can ultimately give this diary back to.
The life of a First World War soldier varied between chaos and monotony. In the hours, days, and weeks between battles, servicemen had to find ways to occupy their time. Some Canadians in the trenches channeled their thoughts by keeping diaries, even though it was strictly forbidden. If caught, they could face court-martial, and for good reason. In enemy hands, a soldier's diary could reveal important details about operational plans, troop size, or armaments. Many of these diaries are now treasured family heirlooms, revealing the first-hand experiences of the men who fought the war. They speak as voices from the battlefield 100 years ago.
Welcome, John, to our show here. You've brought in a rather interesting item and very unique item. It's a diary, but maybe let's look at what that diary actually is.
Well, Mark, it is a First World War diary, and it was written by a private Frank Harper, and details his time in the trenches in the last roughly 100 days of the war. We received it from a pair of Air Force veterans who were cleaning out their house, and they found this in the attic, and they brought it in and said, find out what you can, and if you can, try and reunite it with a living descendant of Frank Harper's. So I've been trying, and so far no luck.
So the notebook is actually an artifact in itself. It's actually got German on the cover of it. The other interesting point is that it starts in September.
Yes.
So it obviously starts when he's in action. So to me, that almost says that it was literally picked up and started at that point.
That's an excellent point, and it's one that I hadn't really considered. It might have been discarded from a retreating German soldier who never got the chance to use it, because I don't see any German writing in it. And unfortunately, there's no publisher marks on it or anything like that. And so we really don't know where it originally came from or what soldier might have carried it. It ended up in Frank Harper's hands, and he decided to, well, I've got this extra paper, I'm going to start keeping a diary.
So what we're seeing here today is a very, very rare artifact, given the fact that not everyone wrote diaries, but also the military didn't really endorse this sort of thing.
Exactly. For an enlisted man under the rank of second lieutenant to write a diary was actually illegal. It was a court-martial offense, because you didn't want any information that could help the enemy falling into enemy hands. Having that information written down was very, very dangerous. Most of the first-hand accounts were written by men after the war. What makes it extremely rare is these diary entries are contemporary. He's writing them down as they are happening, so you can't get more accurate than that. For him to keep that diary, he would have had to probably spirit it away on his uniform somehow. Kind of a brave or somewhat stupid idea of him to do that, but we're glad he did, because very rare to have an actual written document from a frontline soldier from that era.
We're 100 years out from the end of the First World War. Obviously, there's no one living from World War I left, and a tenuous link is this diary, I think, to a time gone by, and that this is a direct link with history, with a World War I soldier sitting in France in 1918 writing his thoughts and comments down as he waged the war.
Frank Harper joined up in mid-1917, July 1917. His first battle was the Battle of Amiens. That was August 8th, 1918. Key battle. The Germans had been driving on the Western Front in France for most of the spring and early summer. By August, the British and Canadian troops stopped them in front of Amiens, and then they counterattacked on the 8th of August. And the German commander, General Ludendorff, said it was the black day of the German army.
Would he have seen a lot of trench action?
Well, he would have been in trenches, yes, but after the Battle of Amiens in August, it was much more fluid. The Germans would retreat and would dig in. The Canadians and the Allies would attack, and then they would dig in, but they weren't digging these complex trench systems that they'd used for the 3 previous years. But as a result, they didn't have the same kind of cover that they had in the trenches, so the casualty rate was very, very high. More Canadian soldiers died in the last 4 months of the war than at any other single period of the war.
We're looking at a fair amount of heavy, intense action that he survived, and he's left us with his own sort of testament to being there.
And I think what's fascinating, not only talking about the battles that he fought in, is what he did after the armistice. I mean, first of all, there's the relief that there's no more fighting, and then there's the okay, now what do we do? And basically let off steam in Brussels, and they're welcomed as liberators by the Belgian people who'd been occupied for so long. And then they move into Germany, where they're actually occupying the left bank of the Rhine in a hostile population and trying to relieve the boredom by doing things to just take their mind off of everything. After all this 4 years of war and intense action, all of a sudden, what do you do? So they did a lot of theatricals and performances and things, and I guess he was really involved in the theater and such. But he did, like most soldiers who had been through that carnage and lived to tell about it, they wanted to enjoy being alive. One of the more poignant things is his very last diary entry. He ended up in Kingston, Ontario, and then he said, in Kingston, demobilized, and then he writes, thank God. So he'd made it all the way through. A diary is a very personal thing. It's a personal thought. And Frank Harper was just an ordinary guy in extraordinary times, and was lucky enough for us, he was able to document that. It brings history alive again. It brings Frank alive.
This example you brought today, John, again, I want to thank you for bringing it, is such a great artifact. It's one that any museum would love to have in their collection. It's a great example of a diary that you don't see every day, a World War I Canadian soldier's journey. And I think that's very rare, and even in today's world, to see those.
It is. Well, they're all gone now, so we can't just, call up one and say, hey, what was it like? And so these kind of documents are very, very important to have. It's a valuable document and a prized piece of history, and our museum is lucky to have it as a caretaker right now, but I know the owners of the diary would like to have it reunited with Frank Harper's family in Tignish, PEI, or wherever they may be. And that's why I brought it here from our museum, to hopefully reach out. And he went by Frank, so if anyone knows a Frank Harper in their family, get in touch with the Nova Scotia Highlanders Regimental Museum.
The quest to reunite this diary with the family, I think, is the biggest story that we can take from this today.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Mark. It's been a real pleasure.
Hopefully there's someone that can be reunited with that document, and they can take and share and be interested in that document like we are today.
So if anyone does know of Frank Harper, if they want to get in touch, we're at the Nova Scotia Highlanders Regimental Museum, and the email is nshmuseum@eastlink.ca. Send us an email and get in touch with us, and we would love to find a descendant of Frank Harper's and hopefully reunite that diary with them.
Coming up on Militaria.
They were my dad's World War I medals. He passed away in 1955 when I was the age of 10. My name is John Meehan, and today I brought in my father's World War I medals. He left them to me because I was the only child. I know that he was in the Royal Enniskillen Fusiliers, and I brought along some certificates about the medals, but there's some gaps which I'm interested in learning.
The Strait of Gallipoli, which is also known as the Dardanelles, is a narrow 61-kilometer stretch of water in northwestern Turkey. It forms part of the continental boundary between Europe and Asia. Gallipoli has been strategically important since ancient times. The city of Troy was located near the western entrance of the strait. The Persian king Xerxes and Alexander the Great of Macedonia both led armies across the Dardanelles. In the First World War, the Allies unsuccessfully attempted to seize the strait from the Ottoman Turks. 11 months of bloody fighting left 350,000 dead or wounded. In the aftermath of the failed campaign, Winston Churchill was removed from control of the British Navy, and Britain's coalition government collapsed.
John, welcome to the show today. You've brought us some medals, and what can you tell us about those?
They were my dad's World War I medals, and I know a little bit about them, but not too much.
What you have here, 1914 star, you have the British War Medal, and you have the Victory Medal.
Many years ago, I learnt that these three medals had been given the name of Pip, Squeak and Wilfred. And I did a little bit of research, but I wonder exactly how it came about.
It was actually, they were named after a cartoon strip in the Daily Mirror. And I think it was, a bit of a joke for returning veterans, to maybe a humble thing to minimize, their contribution. And I just think it's very, it's a great thing that they came up with this, this little nickname for them. It's more of a British thing. I don't think many Canadians refer to them as that. So this is a trio of medals from the First World War. And judging by the 14 star, your father was very early in the First World War. In fact, he's got a bar for the August to November 1914, which means he was under fire in France between those dates. And your father would have been what they call one of the old contemptibles, which was the pre-war British Army. The old contemptibles were the pre-war British military. So it was basically the professional soldiers that would spend their whole lives in the military, and that was their jobs, that was their life, and fortunately a lot of those gentlemen passed away in the First World War. This is his medal index card, and it explains a little bit where he served. We don't have a large part of his file, but you can see here 2nd Battalion Balkans with the date 26/7/15. So that's when he would have gone to Salonika with the 2nd Battalion. A lot of times troops would be shifted back and forth as the need arose. The Irish played a very important role in the British military. During the First World War, there was about 200,000 Irish that participated in the First World War, but 49,000 died from being killed in action or disease. So it was a big part of the First World War. The Royal Enniskillen Fusiliers during the First World War were basically everywhere. So you had up to 9 battalions of soldiers. Each battalion was about 1,000 men. So they were basically serving all over the globe. Some were in the Balkans, some were on the Western Front, some were serving in Gallipoli. So they were everywhere. I mean, every major battle, different battalions.
He was born in what is now Northern Ireland, but at the time it was just Ireland, and he was born in a little village by the name Maguire's Bridge. I don't know a lot about my dad's family. I did meet them usually every year between the age of probably 3 and 10. I don't know when he moved to England, but my mum and he married later on in life. He was probably in his late 40s or early 50s when he got married. Hence the difference between 1892 and my birth in 1945. He passed away in 1955 when I was the age of 10. Some of the things on those index cards mentioned POW, and I guessed he must have been a prisoner of war, but I didn't know when.
So I did some research online with a friend, and we were able to track down another couple of documents. It did mention that he was taken prisoner towards the end of the war in 1918.
My daughter thought, from what she could find out, that he may have been at Gallipoli.
The 2nd Battalion and the 8th and 9th Service Battalion of the Enniskillen Fusiliers were there. I don't know how much you know about Gallipoli.
I've heard a lot of stories about Gallipoli.
It was basically a military disaster.
Yep.
There was about 480,000 troops that were landed. Casualties were very heavy. I think casualties were about 250,000. That's killed in action, died of disease, and wounded. Basically, they landed all these troops on the shores, and they didn't have enough supplies, they didn't have enough shells. Winston Churchill, who was the first Lord of the Admiralty, was big on Gallipoli. He wanted to push it through, got his wish, and he ended up resigning over it. And the British Prime Minister also ended up resigning. It was pretty much a big scandal because it was such a disastrous campaign. They were there for about 11 months, from February 15 to January of 1916, and then evacuated. I think the best way to keep the memory of our veterans from the First World War alive is to keep educating ourselves on their sacrifices. You know, dig deep into your family's history. Pretty sure that you're going to find someone that served. Teach our kids about it. Focus on that in school curriculums, and make sure that it's never forgotten.
During Remembrance, when our Legion, we taught to schools, we'd say the same thing: have respect for those that served.
John, thank you very much for bringing these in. I appreciate that. I enjoyed looking at them.
Yep.
Unfortunately, we don't have more information for you, but yeah, I think it's a great piece of family history and early First World War history.
Yep. Well, I thank you for the information that you've given us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Andrew suggested that I look at mounting those. They're kept in a position of prominence in our house. We have a display cabinet, and they're there on the glass shelf. But I could definitely, if I can get some pictures of my dad, which are hard to come by, I may look at doing that.